Marcus returned to Denver as a convicted felon with a foreign assault conviction, a reality that made finding employment nearly impossible. His old job in marketing was gone, filled by someone who hadn't spent 3 years in a British prison for assaulting a military service member. Most employers wouldn't even consider interviewing someone with his criminal record, and those who did quickly changed their minds once they learned the details of his conviction. The apartment he'd shared with Sarah was now occupied by strangers. His belongings had been sold or donated years ago, leaving him with nothing but the clothes he'd been wearing when deported and a criminal record that would follow him forever. His parents allowed him to stay in their basement temporarily, but the atmosphere in the house was tense and awkward. They struggled to reconcile the son they'd raised with the person who'd committed such a senseless act of violence. Guardsman James Mitchell had returned to duty after extensive medical treatment, but his life had been permanently altered by Marcus's attack. The scarring on his arm was a daily reminder of the assault, and he'd developed anxiety about public appearances that affected his ability to perform ceremonial duties. Despite his determination to continue serving, the psychological impact of being attacked while simply doing his job had changed his relationship with the military service he'd once loved unconditionally. Marcus found work eventually, though not the kind of career he'd once imagined for himself. A small landscaping company was willing to hire him despite his record, and he spent his days doing manual labor for minimum wage, work that left him exhausted and gave him plenty of time to think about the choices that had brought him to this point. The physical demands were nothing compared to the mental weight of knowing he'd permanently damaged another person's life for no good reason. Social media, which had once been Marcus's passion and potential path to fame, became a source of ongoing torment. His case had become a cautionary tale shared in discussions about online culture and the lengths people would go to for viral content. Whenever the story resurfaced, as it did periodically, Marcus would see his name associated with phrases like entitled American tourist and social media sociopath. The internet never forgot, and neither did the people who encountered his story. The compensation Marcus owed to Mitchell was garnished from his wages, meaning that even his modest landscaping income was reduced further. He would be paying for Mitchell's ongoing medical care and therapy for decades to come, a financial burden that served as a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. Every paycheck was a reminder that his momentary desire for internet fame had created lifetime obligations to the person he'd harmed. Therapy helped Marcus begin to understand the psychology behind his actions, though understanding didn't eliminate the consequences. He learned about the dopamine hits that come from social media validation and how the pursuit of online fame can override moral judgment and empathy. He recognized that he'd gradually lost the ability to see other people as real individuals rather than props for his content, a dehumanization that had made his assault on Mitchell possible. Years passed slowly. Marcus's attempts to rebuild relationships with family members met with mixed success. Some relatives were willing to maintain limited contact, while others cut him off completely. Dating was virtually impossible. Few people were interested in building a relationship with someone whose first search result was a news story about assaulting a British soldier for social media content. The isolation was profound and seemingly permanent. Mitchell, meanwhile, had found ways to heal and move forward despite the ongoing effects of the attack. He'd become an advocate for tourism safety and cultural education, speaking to groups about the importance of respecting local customs and understanding that tourist destinations involve real people doing real jobs. His scarred arm had become a symbol of resilience rather than just victimization, though the trauma would never completely disappear. Marcus's story became required viewing in social media ethics courses at universities and was referenced in discussions about the psychological effects of online culture. Researchers studying the relationship between social media addiction and antisocial behavior often cited his case as an extreme example of how the pursuit of viral content could lead to criminal activity. His 15 minutes of fame had arrived, but not in any way he could have imagined. On the 5th anniversary of his deportation, Marcus wrote another letter to Mitchell, as he had every year since his conviction. He never expected a response and had never received one, but the annual ritual of acknowledging the harm he'd caused and expressing genuine remorse had become part of his ongoing attempt to take responsibility for his actions. The letter would go unanswered, but writing it reminded Marcus that healing required more than just serving his sentence. It required a lifetime commitment to being better than the person who had prioritized internet points over human decency. The young man who'd once dreamed of viral fame had learned that some prices are too high to pay for attention and some mistakes too severe to ever fully repair. Marcus's harsh lesson was complete, but the consequences would continue for the rest of his life. The trial began 3 months after Marcus's arrest, during which time he'd been held in HMP Wandsworth, a Victorian-era prison that housed some of London's most serious offenders. The months of imprisonment had changed Marcus physically and mentally. The confident social media personality who'd arrived in London was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed young man who'd learned harsh lessons about respect, consequences, and the real world beyond his phone screen. Guardsman James Mitchell took the witness stand on the second day of testimony. His left arm bore visible scarring from the chemical burns, and he had to take frequent breaks during his testimony due to ongoing pain and mobility issues. Mitchell described his 3 years of exemplary service, his pride in representing the Crown, and the physical and emotional trauma he'd endured as a result of Marcus's attack. "I've served in challenging conditions," Mitchell testified, his voice steady but strained. "But I never expected to be assaulted while performing ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. The burns were excruciating, but the betrayal of trust was worse. Tourists come to see us because they respect what we represent. This defendant turned that into an opportunity to cause harm for his own entertainment." The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented evidence of Marcus's premeditation, including internet searches he'd conducted for strongest hot sauce and how to make royal guards react. His social media history revealed a pattern of increasingly reckless behavior designed to generate online attention. Expert testimony established that the hot sauce contained capsaicin concentrations that met legal definitions for chemical weapons, and medical evidence documented the severity of Mitchell's injuries. Marcus's defense. Team tried to argue that their client was young and foolish rather than malicious, but the judge showed little sympathy. Judge Margaret Thornton had presided over terrorism cases and serious assaults for over 2 decades, and she made it clear that she viewed Marcus's actions as a calculated attack on a British service member rather than a prank gone wrong. The defendant may claim this was intended as harmless fun, Judge Thornton stated during sentencing, but the evidence shows extensive planning, knowledge of the weapon's dangerous properties, and deliberate targeting of a military service member. The fact that he intended to film and broadcast the assault for social media makes it even more reprehensible. The victim impact statements were devastating. Mitchell's commanding officer described how the attack had affected morale throughout the regiment and forced changes to security protocols that had been in place for decades. Mitchell's mother, speaking on behalf of her son, talked about watching her child suffer through painful treatments and struggle with anxiety about returning to duty. The ripple effects of Marcus's prank had spread far beyond the initial incident. Marcus was sentenced to 6 years in prison, followed by deportation and a lifetime ban from entering the United Kingdom. The judge also ordered him to pay compensation to Mitchell for medical expenses and ongoing care, a sum that would likely follow Marcus for the rest of his life. As the sentence was announced, Marcus finally broke down, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally overwhelming. His ability to maintain composure. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive and universally critical. American news outlets picked up the story as an example of social media culture gone wrong, while British papers used it as evidence of American tourists' disrespect for local customs and institutions. Marcus's name became synonymous with entitled behavior and cultural insensitivity, a cautionary tale that would follow him long after his release from prison. His family's reaction was perhaps the most painful consequence of all. His parents had spent their life savings on legal fees trying to help their son, only to watch him receive a lengthy prison sentence for behavior they couldn't understand or excuse. His younger sister, who had looked up to him as a creative and funny big brother, now refused to speak to him. The relationships he'd taken for granted were shattered by his pursuit of temporary internet fame. Marcus spent his remaining time in British custody writing letters of apology that would never be enough to undo the damage he'd caused. He tried to understand how he'd become someone who would assault an innocent person for social media content, and slowly began to recognize the toxic culture of attention-seeking that had consumed his life. The realization came too late to prevent the consequences, but it marked the beginning of a long process of taking responsibility for his actions. The day of his deportation, Marcus was escorted by immigration officials to Heathrow Airport, where he was placed on a flight to Denver with instructions never to return to the UK. As the plane lifted off, he looked down at the country where he'd destroyed his future and permanently harmed an innocent person, all for a few seconds of video. Content that had never even been posted to social media. The holding cell at the Metropolitan Police Station was nothing like what Marcus had seen in American movies. The walls were a depressing shade of green, the lighting was harsh and unforgiving, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with decades of human misery created an atmosphere that immediately crushed any remaining traces of his earlier confidence. Marcus sat on the narrow bench, his hands still bearing traces of the hot sauce that had caused all this trouble, and tried to process how drastically his life had changed in the span of a few hours. Detective Inspector Sarah Crawford had seen. Plenty of tourists make poor decisions during her 15 years with the Met, but Marcus's case was particularly disturbing because of how calculated it appeared to be. The interview room where she questioned him was equipped with recording equipment that captured every word, every expression, every moment of realization as Marcus began to understand the serious legal trouble he was facing. "You brought a chemical irritant from the United States with the specific intention of using it on a member of Her Majesty's Guard," Detective Crawford stated, reading from the preliminary charges. "The substance has been analyzed and found to contain capsaicin concentrations that classify it as a chemical weapon under UK law. The guard you targeted, Guardsman James Mitchell, has suffered second-degree chemical burns and may have permanent scarring." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Chemical weapon, permanent scarring. These weren't terms associated with pranks or social media content. These were serious criminal charges that could result in years in prison. Marcus tried to explain that he'd never intended to cause real harm, that it was supposed to be funny, that he'd seen other people do similar things online. But every explanation sounded more pathetic and inadequate as he spoke. Detective Crawford showed Marcus photographs of Guardsman Mitchell's injuries. The angry red welts across the young soldier's arm and chest looked like severe burns from a fire, rather than the effects of what Marcus had considered just hot sauce. The medical report indicated that Mitchell would require ongoing treatment and might need skin grafts if the damage didn't heal properly. The 22-year-old guardsman had been serving with distinction for 3 years and had never experienced anything like this in his military career. The legal system Marcus found himself navigating was complex and unforgiving. His duty solicitor, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Wells, explained that the Crown Prosecution Service was treating this as a serious assault case with potential terrorism enhancements. The fact that Marcus had planned the attack in advance, brought the weapon from overseas, and targeted a military service member at a royal residence meant that prosecutors could argue for the maximum penalties under multiple statutes. The magistrate will likely deny bail, Patricia explained during their first meeting. "You're a foreign national who committed a planned assault on a military target. The court will consider you a flight risk and potentially dangerous to the public. We're looking at months of detention while this works through the system, and if convicted, you could face up to 10 years in prison. 10 years! Marcus couldn't wrap his mind around the number. He'd be in his mid-30s when he got out. His job in Denver would be gone. His relationship with Sarah would probably be over. His family would be devastated. All for what he'd thought would be a few minutes of internet fame. The hot sauce that had cost him $30 at a novelty shop was going to cost him a decade of his life. The media attention began almost immediately. British tabloids loved stories about clueless American tourists causing problems, and Marcus's case had all the elements of a perfect scandal. "Yanks chemical attack on Royal Guard," screamed one headline. "American tourists' sick prank lands hero soldier in hospital," declared another. Marcus's social media accounts, which he'd hoped would gain millions of followers from his viral prank, instead became evidence in his prosecution and sources of international mockery. Sarah was allowed to visit him once before being advised by embassy officials to return to the United States. The conversation was awkward and painful, conducted through thick glass with guards listening to every word. Sarah had been questioned for hours about whether she'd known of Marcus's plans, and while she'd been cleared of any involvement, the experience had traumatized her. She looked at Marcus like she was seeing a stranger. "I don't understand how you could think this was okay," she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and disappointment. "That guard is someone's son. He was just doing his job. How did you become someone who would hurt an innocent person for internet points?" Marcus tried to answer, but he realized he didn't have a good explanation. Somewhere along the way, his desire for attention had overridden his basic human decency, and he couldn't pinpoint exactly when or how it had happened. The American embassy offered limited assistance. A consular official visited Marcus to ensure he was being treated properly and to help him contact his family, but they made it clear that the U.S. government couldn't and wouldn't intervene in what was clearly a legitimate criminal prosecution. Marcus was on his own in a foreign legal system, facing charges that could destroy his future, all because he'd wanted to create viral content that would make strangers on the internet laugh for 30 seconds. The moment Marcus's hand made contact with the guard's sleeve, everything went wrong simultaneously. The hot sauce, which had seemed manageable in the tiny container, immediately began to spread and intensify upon contact with the wool fabric. The guard's training kicked in instantly. Not the ceremonial training that kept him standing at attention, but his combat training that taught him to respond to potential threats with swift, decisive action. Before Marcus could even process what was happening, the guard had pivoted with military precision, his rifle moving from ceremonial position to a defensive stance in one fluid motion. Other guards who had seemed statue-like moments before suddenly sprung into coordinated action, appearing from positions Marcus hadn't even noticed. Within seconds, what had been a peaceful tourist scene transformed into a security response that looked like something from an action movie. Marcus found himself face down on the ground before he fully understood what had occurred. Professional. Hands searched him efficiently while voices shouted commands in crisp British accents. The small container of hot sauce had fallen from his grip and shattered on the pavement, its contents spreading in a dark puddle that immediately began to affect everyone in the vicinity. Tourists started coughing and backing away, their eyes streaming as the concentrated capsaicin became airborne. The guard Marcus had targeted was experiencing the full effects of the hot sauce soaking through his uniform. Despite his training, he couldn't suppress his body's natural response to the intense chemical burn spreading across his arm and torso. His breathing became labored, and angry red welts began forming wherever the substance had made contact with his skin. Medical personnel who had appeared seemingly from nowhere began treating him while maintaining the security perimeter around Marcus. Sarah watched in horror from across the street as her boyfriend disappeared beneath a pile of security personnel. She had expected him to do something silly and embarrassing, maybe hold up a funny sign or make faces at the guards. She had never imagined he would do something that would result in armed soldiers treating him like a genuine threat. Her hands shook as she recorded everything on her phone, not for social media content anymore, but as potential evidence for whatever legal proceedings were surely coming. The crowd that had been peacefully watching the ceremonial guards suddenly found themselves in the middle of a legitimate security incident. Police officers were redirecting foot traffic. Ambulances had arrived to treat the affected guard and several tourists who had been contaminated by the airborne hot sauce particles, and bomb disposal experts were examining the shattered container to determine if it posed any additional threats. Marcus tried to explain that it was just a prank, but his words came out as muffled protests against the pavement. Nobody was interested in his explanations at that moment. The priority was securing the area and ensuring there were no additional threats. The hot sauce had created a genuine chemical hazard zone, with emergency responders wearing protective gear to clean up the contaminated area. As he lay there with his hands zip-tied behind his back, Marcus began to realize the magnitude of what he had done. The guard he'd targeted wasn't just uncomfortable. He was in genuine pain and potentially serious medical danger. The hot sauce Marcus had thought was merely really spicy was actually causing chemical burns that required immediate medical attention. What he'd imagined as a harmless prank had become an assault on a military service member. The police officers who eventually pulled Marcus to his feet weren't the friendly bobbies he'd seen in movies. These were armed response specialists trained to deal with threats against high-value targets. They informed him in no uncertain terms that he was under arrest for assault, potential terrorism charges, and a list of other offenses that seemed to grow longer with each passing minute. The word terrorism hit Marcus like a physical blow. That wasn't what this was supposed to be at all. Emergency medical technicians were still working on the guard, who had been helped out of his contaminated uniform and was receiving treatment for chemical burns across a significant portion of his upper body. The hot sauce had soaked through multiple layers of fabric and was continuing to cause tissue damage even after the initial contact. What Marcus had assumed would be a momentary discomfort was actually a serious medical emergency requiring specialized treatment. The area around Buckingham Palace had essentially shut down. Tourist access was suspended. Additional security personnel had arrived from multiple agencies, and hazmat teams were working to decontaminate the affected area. Marcus's harmless prank had triggered a full-scale emergency response that was costing thousands of pounds and affecting thousands of people's daily routines. As they led him toward a waiting police vehicle, Marcus caught a glimpse of Sarah, being questioned by officers across the street. She was crying and gesturing frantically, clearly trying to explain that she had no knowledge of what he'd been planning. The reality of how his actions were affecting not just himself, but everyone around him was finally beginning to penetrate his shock and confusion. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace were thicker than Marcus had expected. Tourists from every corner of the world pressed against the iron railings, cameras and phones held high, everyone hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards. Marcus felt a surge of confidence as he blended into the crowd. With so many people around, security would be focused on managing the masses rather than watching for individual troublemakers. He spotted his target almost immediately. A tall guard in the iconic red tunic and black bearskin hat stood at perfect attention near the palace gates. The man couldn't have been much older than Marcus himself, with sharp features visible beneath the shadow of his ceremonial headwear. His rifle was held at exactly the right angle, his posture immaculate, despite having stood motionless for what must have been at least an hour already. Marcus began working his way through the crowd, using his elbows and fake apologies to push closer to the front. Other tourists shot him annoyed looks, but he ignored them, focused entirely on his mission. Sarah had positioned herself across the street as planned, though she kept gesturing for him to tell her what he was doing. Marcus just winked and gave her a thumbs up, which only seemed to increase her confusion and concern. When he finally reached the front barrier, Marcus was close enough to see the fine details of the guard's uniform. The wool fabric looked incredibly heavy and warm, and Marcus could see small beads of perspiration on the man's forehead despite the cool morning air. For just a moment, Marcus felt a twinge of sympathy. Standing motionless in that heavy uniform, for hours at a time, couldn't be comfortable. but he quickly pushed the feeling aside, reminding himself that this was going to be legendary content. The changing of the guard ceremony was still 20 minutes away, which gave Marcus time to prepare and position himself perfectly. He carefully removed the small container of hot sauce from his pocket, keeping it concealed in his palm. The substance felt warm against his skin, and he could smell its intense, almost chemical odor even through the sealed container. Several other tourists near him wrinkled their noses, but nobody seemed to realize where the smell was coming from. Marcus began to have second thoughts as he stared at the professional soldier in front of him. The guard's eyes were fixed straight ahead, but there was an alertness to his posture that suggested he was very much aware of everything happening around him. These weren't actors or volunteers. They were trained military personnel with real responsibilities. But Marcus's desire for viral fame overpowered his brief moment of clarity, and he began to execute his plan. Pretending to study a tourist map, Marcus approached the barrier and called out to the guard. "Excuse me, sir, could you help me with directions?" The guard, as expected, didn't respond or even acknowledge Marcus's presence. This was perfect. It would make the eventual reaction even more dramatic. Marcus continued talking, creating a performance for his imagined audience of future viewers. "I'm looking for Westminster Abbey, and I'm completely lost," Marcus continued, his voice getting louder and more animated. Other tourists began to take notice, some pulling out their own cameras thinking they might witness the rare spectacle of a guard-breaking character. Marcus smiled to himself. He was already drawing an audience, which would make his eventual success even sweeter. What Marcus didn't notice was the subtle shift in the guard's posture, or the way the man's eyes had begun to track Marcus's movements, without moving his head. Years of training had taught the guard to remain outwardly motionless while staying intensely aware of potential threats, and something about this particular tourist was beginning to register as suspicious. The overly loud voice, the exaggerated confusion, the way he kept shifting his weight and moving closer to the barrier, all of it suggested someone who wasn't behaving naturally. Marcus opened the small container in his palm, immediately hit by the full force of the hot sauce's overwhelming scent. His eyes began to water involuntarily, and he had to resist the urge to cough. The liquid inside was so potent that just opening the container in the open air was enough to cause a reaction. But rather than recognizing this as a warning sign, Marcus interpreted his body's natural defense response as confirmation that his plan would work perfectly. He began to reach through the barrier, ostensibly to tap the guard on the shoulder to get his attention. In reality, he planned to smear the hot sauce on the man's uniform sleeve, where it would eventually be transferred to his hands and face. It seemed like a foolproof plan, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but effective enough to guarantee a dramatic reaction that would make internet history. Marcus Thompson had always considered himself the king of pranks back home in Denver. At 24, he'd built a modest social media following documenting his increasingly bold stunts around the city. From putting googly eyes on every statue, downtown to convincing his local coffee shop to serve mystery flavor lattes that were actually just regular coffee with food coloring, Marcus thrived on the attention and laughter his antics generated. When his girlfriend Sarah surprised him with a trip to London for his birthday, Marcus immediately began plotting ways to create content that would go viral. He spent hours researching famous London landmarks, but nothing excited him more than the idea of getting a reaction from the famously stoic royal guards at Buckingham Palace. He'd seen countless videos of tourists trying and failing to make the guards break character, and he was convinced he could be the first to succeed. The night before visiting the palace, Marcus sat in their cramped hotel room near Victoria Station, scrolling through his phone and watching compilation videos of tourists attempting to distract the guards. Sarah was already asleep, exhausted from their first day of sightseeing, but Marcus was wide awake, his mind racing with possibilities. He'd brought along his secret weapon from home, a small bottle of Death's Door hot sauce that claimed to be one of the hottest condiments on the planet. The label warned that even a single drop could cause intense burning sensations lasting up to 30 minutes. Marcus had purchased the hot sauce specifically for this trip, imagining himself as some sort of international prankster who would create legendary content. He'd tested it on himself back home, touching just the tip of his finger to the sauce and then to his tongue. The experience had left him gasping and drinking milk for 20 minutes, but in his excitement, he'd convinced himself that the reaction had been exaggerated. Surely it wasn't that bad, and surely a trained professional like a royal guard could handle a little surprise. As he lay in bed that night, Marcus rehearsed his plan over and over. He would approach one of the guards during the changing of the guard ceremony, when crowds were thick and distracting. He'd pretend to ask for directions while discreetly applying a small amount of the hot sauce to his palm. Then he'd offer to shake the guard's hand as a gesture of thanks. When the guard inevitably touched his face later or rubbed his eyes, the reaction would be priceless. Marcus imagined the headlines: "American tourist finally cracks royal guard's composure," or "The prank that made history at Buckingham Palace." What Marcus failed to consider in his excitement was the reality of what he was planning. Royal guards aren't just ceremonial figures dressed up for tourists. They're active duty soldiers from elite regiments trained in combat and security. More importantly, they're human beings doing their jobs, not props for social media content. The hot sauce he carried wasn't a harmless novelty item, but a genuinely dangerous substance that could cause serious injury if it came into contact with someone's eyes or mouth. But Marcus was too caught up in his fantasy of internet fame to consider these crucial details. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that should have served as an omen for what was to come. Marcus woke up with butterflies in his stomach, not from nervousness about the potential consequences of his actions, but from excitement about the content he was about to create. He spent extra time getting ready, making sure his phone was fully charged and that he had multiple camera angles planned. He even convinced Sarah to position herself across the street to film from a distance, though he didn't tell her exactly what he was planning to do. As they rode the tube toward Buckingham Palace, Marcus couldn't stop fidgeting with the small bottle in his jacket pocket. He'd transferred some of the hot sauce into an even smaller container to make it easier to conceal and deploy quickly. The liquid inside was an ominous dark red color, almost black, and it had a consistency that reminded him of motor oil. Warning. Labels covered nearly every inch of the tiny bottle, but Marcus had long since stopped reading them. In his mind, he was about to make history, and nothing else mattered.